Pass the gravy down to Uncle Robert, would you, Melissa? My stepmother Patricia's voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted to remind everyone that I was useful for serving mothers. I reached across the mahogany dining table, careful not to disturb the elaborate centerpiece she'd spent 3 hours arranging this morning, and handed the crystal gravy boat to my father's younger brother. Sunday dinner at the Thornfield family estate had been a tradition for 32 years. Ever since my father inherited the sprawling Victorian mansion from his parents. Even after his death 8 months ago, Patricia insisted on maintaining the ritual. 23 family members gathered every week in the formal dining room, seated according to a hierarchy that had never been officially discussed, but everyone understood. I sat in the middle of the long table, between my teenage cousin Marcus and great-aunt Helen, who always smelled like lavender and disappointment. My half-sister Clarissa occupied the chair to Patricia's right, the position of honor that came with being the biological daughter. She'd held that seat since she was old enough to sit up straight, her golden hair catching the light from the chandelier like some sort of Renaissance painting. "So, Melissa," my Uncle Robert said, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision, "Patricia tells us you're still working at that little law firm downtown. Have you considered something more substantial?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I'd heard variations of it every Sunday for the past 15 years, ever since I graduated law school and chose to work at a small firm specializing in family law and estate planning rather than joining the corporate practice that handled the Thornfield family's business interests. "Henderson and Associates suits me perfectly," I replied, taking a measured sip of wine. "We handle complex estate work. Quite fascinating, actually." Clarissa snorted delicately, a sound she'd perfected in finishing school. "Estate work? You mean helping old people write their wills? That's hardly practicing law." "Oh, it's more involved than that," I said evenly. "Trust administration, probate litigation, tax planning. You'd be surprised how complicated family wealth can become when proper documentation isn't in place." Patricia set down her fork with a soft clink. "Speaking of family wealth, I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room." The conversation at the table gradually died as her words registered. Uncle Robert paused mid-chew. Cousin Michael stopped scrolling through his phone. Even great-aunt Helen looked up from her dinner roll. "What elephant would that be?" I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. Clarissa straightened in her chair, and I caught the look that passed between her and Patricia. They planned this. The realization hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my expression neutral. 28 years of family dinners had taught me to hide my reactions. "The will," Patricia said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when discussing household staff schedules. "Your father's will. We've all been tiptoeing around it for months, but it's time to be practical." "I wasn't aware there was anything to discuss," I said carefully. "Dad's will was quite clear. The estate was divided equally between Clarissa and myself, with smaller bequests to." "That's exactly the problem," Clarissa interrupted, her cheeks flushing the way they always did when she was about to say something she knew would cause damage. "The will treats us as equals, but we're not equals, are we?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could feel everyone's attention focusing on our end of the table like a laser beam. Uncle Robert had stopped eating entirely. Cousin Jennifer was staring openly, her mouth slightly agape. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, though I absolutely knew what she meant. I'd known this conversation was coming since the day after Dad's funeral, when Patricia had suggested we reassess the family structure now that the patriarch was gone. Clarissa took a deep breath, the kind she used to take before diving off the high board at the country club pool. Melissa is adopted. She's not actually Dad's daughter. She shouldn't inherit the same amount as me. The words hit the table like a grenade. Several people gasped audibly. Great Aunt Helen dropped her dinner roll. Cousin Marcus, who was 17 and normally glued to his phone, looked up with wide eyes. Clarissa, Uncle Robert said in a warning tone, but Patricia held up her hand. No, Robert. She's right to bring this up. We've all been thinking it. Patricia's gaze swept the table, and I watched as several family members nodded slightly. Harold was generous to a fault, but he wasn't thinking clearly in his final years. The family assets should stay with family. Blood family, Clarissa added, as if the distinction needed clarification. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching the faces around the table. These people had been at every birthday party, every graduation, every holiday for the past 28 years. I'd helped plan Uncle Robert's surprise 60th birthday party. I'd babysat Cousin Michael when he was in elementary school. I'd written the legal documents for Great Aunt Helen's trust fund. And now they were nodding in agreement as my legitimacy as a family member was dissected over Sunday roast. The adoption was finalized when Melissa was 3, Uncle Robert said slowly, though his voice lacked conviction. Harold considered her his daughter. Legal technicalities. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. The point is, she's not a Thornfield. Not really. The family money should stay with the family line. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Clarissa leaned forward eagerly. A revised distribution. You can keep the house in the city, and maybe one of the smaller investment accounts. But the estate, the business interests, the family trust, that should come to me. I'm going to have children someday. Real Thornfield children. The phrase real Thornfield children hung in the air like a slap. I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. And you all agree with this assessment? I asked, looking around the table. More nods. Murmurs of agreement. Cousin Jennifer cleared her throat. It does make sense, Melissa. I mean, we love you. But I'm not really family. I finished for her. Exactly. Clarissa's voice was bright with relief, as if we'd finally gotten past an awkward misunderstanding. You can still come to Sunday dinners, of course. Nothing has to change between us personally. I took another sip of wine, buying myself time to process what was happening. These people, my family for 28 years, had just voted me out of my inheritance while assuring me I could still serve them gravy on Sundays. Have you discussed this with the estate attorney? I asked. Patricia's smile tightened slightly. We thought we'd handle it as a family first. Work out the details amongst ourselves before involving lawyers. I see. I set down my wine glass with deliberate care. And when exactly did you all decide this? Was there a family meeting I wasn't invited to? Now don't be dramatic. Great Aunt Helen spoke up for the first time. We're just being practical. You're a lovely girl, dear, but you're not a Thornfield. The money should stay with blood. I nodded slowly, as if considering their position. Around the table, I could see the relief on their faces. They'd expected a fight, tears, perhaps threats of legal action. Instead, I was being reasonable, diplomatic, just like I always was. Well, I said finally, I can certainly understand your perspective. Clarissa beamed. I knew you'd be sensible about this. You always were the practical one. There's just one small problem with your plan, I continued, reaching into my purse. Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. What sort of problem? I pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sealed with burgundy wax. Dad's personal seal, the one he'd used for important documents. Every person at the table recognized it immediately. Dad left me this, I said simply, setting the envelope on the table between the candlesticks, with instructions to open it if anyone ever questioned my place in the family. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its ticking. What is it? Clarissa's voice had lost its confident edge. A letter, I said. Would you like me to read it? Patricia's face had gone pale. Melissa, there's no need to. Oh, I think there is. I broke the wax seal with careful precision, unfolded the pages inside, and stood up. This is dated 3 days before Dad died, witnessed by his attorney and his doctor. My hands were steady as I began to read. Though my heart was pounding so hard, I was surprised. No one could hear it. To my beloved daughter, Melissa, I began. If you are reading this letter, it means someone in the family has questioned your right to inherit equally with Clarissa. I hoped this day would never come, but I know my wife and daughter well enough to prepare for it. Patricia made a small sound like air escaping from a balloon. I want you to know that from the moment you came into our lives, you were never anything less than my daughter. Not adopted daughter, not stepdaughter, my daughter, period. But there are things about your adoption that the family doesn't know, things I've kept private to protect you. I paused, looking around the table. Every face was frozen in anticipation. Melissa is not adopted from strangers, as everyone believes. She is my biological daughter, born from a relationship I had before I married Patricia. Her mother, Catherine Williams, was a remarkable woman who died in a car accident when Melissa was 2. I adopted my own daughter to give her legal protection and a stable family, not because she wasn't already mine. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, but I kept reading. The DNA test results are in my safe deposit box, witnessed and notarized. Melissa is a Thornfield by blood and by love. More than that, she is the child who chose to spend her life helping families navigate legal complexities, who dedicated herself to protecting people's rights, who understood the value of fairness and justice that I tried to instill in both my daughters. Clarissa had gone white as the tablecloth. Patricia was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. For this reason, and because I believe she will honor the family legacy better than anyone, I am leaving the majority of my estate to Melissa. The will filed with the court is not my final will. The real will is in my safe deposit box, along with the DNA results and documentation of Melissa's true parentage. She inherits the house, the business interests, and 80% of my liquid assets. Clarissa will receive 20%, which is more than generous considering her complete lack of interest in anything beyond her own comfort. I folded the letter carefully and looked around the table. The silence was deafening. There's more, I said quietly. Instructions for Patricia's widow's pension, which was contingent on her treating me with respect, and a provision that anyone who contests this will or attempts to exclude me from family functions will forfeit their inheritance entirely. Patricia finally found her voice. That's impossible. We saw the will. The lawyer read it. You saw the preliminary will, I corrected. Dad filed the real one 3 days later, after he realized what might happen. He'd been watching the family dynamics for months. He knew exactly how this conversation would go. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. How long have you known? Since the day he died. His attorney gave me the letter along with the keys to the safe deposit box. Dad wanted me to wait and see if the family would accept me as I was, or if I'd need to, clarify my position. Clarissa's face was a mottled red and white. You let us believe. You sat there while you revealed exactly who you are, I said gently. Yes, I did. The next few minutes were chaos. Patricia stood up so quickly, she knocked over her water glass. Clarissa started crying, not the delicate tears she used for sympathy, but ugly, desperate sobs. Uncle Robert was on his phone, presumably calling the family lawyer. Several cousins were talking at once, their voices rising in pitch and volume. I sat quietly through it all, the letter still in my hands. Great Aunt Helen, who had remained silent through the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. So you're actually Harold's daughter? His biological daughter? Yes, I said simply. She nodded slowly. And you're inheriting the estate? The majority of it, yes. And you could have told us this at any time over the past 8 months. I could have. Another nod. But you wanted to see what we do first. Dad wanted to see what you do first. Great Aunt Helen picked up her dinner roll and took a thoughtful bite. Smart man, Harold. Always was good at reading people. By the time the initial shock wore off, half the family had left. Uncle Robert and his wife hurried out after a terse conversation with their lawyer. Several cousins made awkward excuses and disappeared. Even the household staff seemed to sense the shift in dynamics. I noticed the way Patricia's personal assistant started avoiding eye contact with her. Patricia herself had locked herself in Dad's study, presumably going through his papers looking for some way to challenge the will. She'd find nothing, of course. Dad had been meticulous. Clarissa sat in her chair like a deflated balloon, mascara streaking down her cheeks. This isn't fair, she whispered. I'm his daughter too. Yes, you are, I agreed. And you'll inherit 20% of a very substantial estate. Most people would consider that life-changing money. But you get everything else. The house, the business, the trust fund. I get the responsibility, I corrected. Do you have any idea what's involved in managing a family trust? The tax implications of the business holdings? The maintenance costs on this house alone. She stared at me blankly. Dad knew what he was doing, I said. He left the money to the person who would protect it, grow it, and use it to take care of the family. That's what I've been training for my entire career, even if I didn't realize it. But you're not even really his daughter, she said weakly, then stopped as she realized what she'd said. Actually, I'm more his daughter than you are, I said without malice. Biologically and legally, but that's not why he chose me. Over the following weeks, the family dynamics shifted like tectonic plates. Patricia moved out of the main house and into the guest cottage. Her status changed from widow of the estate owner to dependent relative. She tried to contest the will, of course, but Dad's documentation was ironclad. The DNA test was conclusive, the witnesses were unimpeachable, and the new will had been filed properly. Clarissa went through what could only be described as an identity crisis. Without the promise of unlimited wealth to cushion her future, she was forced to confront the reality that she'd never developed any actual skills or interests. She eventually took a job at a local boutique, which was humbling for someone who'd never worked a day in her life. Some family members, Uncle Robert, a few of the cousins, made genuine efforts to rebuild their relationships with me. Others simply disappeared, unwilling to accept the new hierarchy. Great Aunt Helen, surprisingly, became one of my strongest allies. I always knew there was more to you than met the eye, she told me one Sunday over tea. You had Harold's patience and his strategic mind. The business interests that Dad had built over 40 years were complex and far-reaching. real estate developments, investment portfolios, charitable foundations, and a small but profitable technology company that he'd started as a side project in the 1990s. Understanding it all, managing it responsibly, required exactly the kind of legal and financial expertise I'd been developing for the past decade. 6 months after that devastating Sunday dinner, I hosted my first board meeting as the primary beneficiary of the Thornfield Trust. The conference room at Henderson and Associates had never seen anything quite like it. 12 board members, 3 attorneys, and 2 accountants, all discussing the strategic direction of a $50 million family estate. Patricia attended, as required by the trust documents, but her role was purely advisory. She sat at the far end of the table, her face a mask of controlled resentment. Clarissa didn't attend at all. She'd waived her board position in exchange for early access to her inheritance. The quarterly reports show strong performance across all sectors, the portfolio manager announced. The real estate holdings have appreciated 12% this year, and the technology investments are exceeding projections. I nodded, making notes on the detailed financial statements. What about the charitable foundation? Are we meeting our distribution requirements? More than meeting them, the foundation's director replied. The scholarship program has expanded to include 3 additional universities, and the family services grants are making a real impact in the community. These were the conversations Dad had prepared me for, I realized. All those dinners where he discussed business strategy while Clarissa played with her phone. All those weekends when he'd invited me to review investment reports while she went shopping. He'd been training his successor, and everyone had assumed it would be his biological son he never had. After the meeting, as the board members filed out discussing lunch plans and golf schedules, Patricia approached my desk. She looked older than her 58 years, as if the stress of the past months had aged her prematurely. "I want you to know I'm not giving up," she said quietly. "Harold was my husband. This estate should be mine." I looked up from the financial reports I was reviewing. "Actually, under Illinois law, you're entitled to exactly what Dad left you: the widow's pension and the cottage. The rest was his to distribute as he saw fit." "You manipulated him," she said, her voice low and bitter. "Turned him against his own wife and daughter. I helped old people write their wills, remember?" I said gently. "Dad taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about who shows up, who takes responsibility, who protects the people they love." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. That evening, I sat in Dad's study, my study now, going through his personal papers. Hidden behind the legal documents and financial statements, I found a folder marked "For Melissa." Inside were photographs from my childhood, report cards he'd saved, copies of awards I'd won in school. At the bottom was a note in his handwriting. "I always knew you'd be the one to carry this forward. You have your mother's compassion and my stubborn streak. Take care of them all, even the ones who don't deserve it." I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the folder. Outside the study windows, I could see the lights of the guest cottage where Patricia was probably planning her next legal challenge. Somewhere across town, Clarissa was working her shift at the boutique, learning for the first time what it meant to earn her own money. The family I'd grown up in was broken, perhaps irreparably. But the responsibility Dad had left me wasn't just about managing money. It was about rebuilding something better. The Sunday dinners continued, though the guest list was smaller now. The family trust continued to grow and support charitable causes. And slowly, carefully, I began reaching out to the family members who were willing to build new relationships based on respect rather than hierarchy. One Sunday evening, as I was closing up the study, I found Great Aunt Helen in the kitchen making tea. "You know," she said, handing me a cup, "your father would be proud. You handled all this with more grace than any of us deserved." "I had a good teacher," I replied. "Yes, you did. But you also had something Harold always hoped for, the wisdom to know when to be patient and when to act." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That letter wasn't just about the inheritance, was it? It was about showing everyone who you really are." I smiled. Dad always said the truth has a way of revealing itself when the time is right. And now? I looked around the kitchen where I'd helped prepare countless Sunday dinners, where I'd learned that family was about more than shared DNA or legal documents. Now we build something new, something better. Great Aunt Helen nodded approvingly. Harold would like that. He always believed in second chances. Third chances, in some cases, I said, thinking of the family members who were slowly, cautiously, trying to rebuild bridges they burned. "Well," she said with a slight smile, "that's what family is for." As I turned off the lights and locked up the house that night, I thought about the conversation that had started it all. Clarissa's declaration that I didn't count, that I wasn't really family, that I shouldn't inherit equally. She'd been wrong about almost everything, but in one sense, she'd been right. I wasn't the same person who'd sat quietly at that dinner table 8 months ago. I was Harold Thornfield's daughter, his chosen successor, and the guardian of his legacy. But more than that, I was someone who'd learned that true family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who's willing to share your burdens, your hopes, and your Sunday dinners, even when the conversation gets difficult. The letter had given me an inheritance, but the confrontation had given me something more valuable, the knowledge of who I really was and who I wanted to become. Table 6 needs their check, and the kitchen's backed up on orders for 12 and 15. My assistant manager, David, appeared at my shoulder with his usual evening urgency as I reviewed the night's receipts at the host station. Tuesday evenings at Harvest were typically manageable, but tonight felt different. The energy was charged, almost electric, in a way that made my instincts prickle. I had been running restaurants for 22 years, starting as a dishwasher at 16 and clawing my way up through every position imaginable. Now, at 38, I owned 5 successful establishments across the metro area, with Harvest being my flagship location in the heart of downtown. The mahogany bar gleamed under warm Edison bulb lighting, and the open kitchen allowed diners to watch my chefs work their magic with locally sourced ingredients. Everything about this place reflected the vision I'd built from nothing. Tell Kitchen to prioritize 12. They're celebrating an anniversary, I instructed David, making a note in my leather-bound manager's log. And send Table 6 a complimentary dessert with their check. The gentleman mentioned it's his wife's birthday. David nodded and hurried away. These details mattered. They were the difference between a good restaurant and a great one, between customers who returned once and those who became regulars. Every decision, every interaction, every perfectly timed course was part of a symphony I'd spent decades learning to conduct. I was adjusting the fresh orchid arrangement near the entrance when the front door burst open with enough force to rattle the glass. The hostess, Jennifer, jumped back as a figure strode through the doorway like he owned the place. My stomach dropped before my brain even processed who it was. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, though you'd never know it from his behavior. He looked exactly the same as when I'd last seen him 4 years ago at our father's funeral, just a little grayer around the temples, and wearing what appeared to be an expensive suit that somehow managed to look cheap on him. His face carried that familiar expression of righteous indignation that had defined our childhood interactions. "Where is she?" Marcus demanded of Jennifer, his voice booming across the dining room. Several customers turned to stare, their conversations faltering. "Where's my sister?" Jennifer's eyes found mine, wide with uncertainty. I straightened my shoulders and walked toward him, my heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. Every step felt measured, deliberate. I wasn't the scared little sister anymore who used to hide in the kitchen pantry when Marcus brought his friends over. "Hello, Marcus," I said evenly, stopping just close enough to keep our conversation from becoming a complete spectacle. "What brings you to my restaurant?" His laugh was bitter, the same dismissive sound I remembered from our teenage years when he'd mock my dreams of opening my own place. "Your restaurant? That's rich, considering Dad built this empire." I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression neutral. "Dad never owned a restaurant, Marcus. You know that." "Don't play stupid with me, Victoria." He stepped closer, and I caught the faint scent of alcohol on his breath. Day drinking, apparently. Some things never changed. The family business. All of this. He gestured broadly at the dining room, the bar, the carefully curated atmosphere I'd spent years perfecting. Dad always said it should be split equally between his children. The absurdity of the statement hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, who had left home at 18 to join a friend's band and had spent the last 20 years drifting between odd jobs and get-rich-quick schemes. Marcus, who hadn't spoken to our father for the final 5 years of his life, because Dad refused to loan him money for yet another failed venture. Marcus, who couldn't be bothered to help when Dad was dying of cancer, leaving me to handle everything from medical decisions to funeral arrangements. "You're drunk," I said quietly, "and you're disturbing my customers. I think you should leave." His face flushed red, the way it always did when someone challenged him. "I'm not going anywhere until we settle this. Dad always promised that his kids would inherit equally. You can't just cut me out because you were the favorite." The favorite. The word was so ludicrous I almost laughed. I had been the one who stayed close to home, who visited Dad every Sunday, who held his hand during chemotherapy treatments while Marcus was somewhere in California claiming to be finding himself. I had been the one who paid Dad's medical bills when his insurance fell short, who organized his medications, who made sure he had groceries and companionship during his final months. But I hadn't done any of that for inheritance or recognition. I'd done it because it was right, because he was my father, and because Marcus had made it clear years earlier that family obligations weren't his priority. "Marcus, you need to calm down," I said, my voice still steady despite the rage building in my chest. "We can discuss this privately in my office if you'd like, but not here. Not in front of my customers." "Your customers?" He laughed again, louder this time. Several diners were now openly staring, their meals forgotten. "These are family business customers, Victoria. Dad started this legacy, and I'm here to claim my half." That's when something inside me snapped. Not visibly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a door closing. Marcus had no idea what he was talking about. None whatsoever. And suddenly, I realized I was done pretending he did. I walked calmly to the host station and retrieved my leather portfolio from the drawer beneath the reservation system. Inside were copies of every important document related to my businesses, organized with the same precision I applied to everything else in my life. My fingers found the folder I needed without hesitation. "You want to discuss the family business?" I asked, returning to where Marcus stood with his arms crossed, looking smug and entitled. "Let's discuss it." I opened the folder and withdrew a thick stack of papers, each page meticulously organized and labeled. The incorporation documents for Victoria's Hospitality Group, dated 15 years ago. The business licenses. The loan applications I'd filled out myself, using my own credit and my own collateral. The property deeds. The insurance policies. Every piece of paper that proved what I'd built had nothing to do with our father's legacy, and everything to do with my own sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights. But the document I handed him was special. It was the agreement Marcus himself had signed when I'd first incorporated my business. I'd been naive enough, hopeful enough, to include him in the early paperwork, just in case he ever decided to be part of the family again, just in case he wanted to be involved in something legitimate and lasting. "Read the last page," I said, my voice calm as still water. Marcus scanned the document, his confidence wavering as he recognized his own signature. The section I'd highlighted in yellow was brief but clear. Marcus Antonio Chin hereby relinquishes any and all claims, current or future, to Victoria's Hospitality Group and any subsidiary businesses, properties, or assets. This agreement is binding and irrevocable. The color drained from his face as the words sank in. I don't remember signing this. You signed it at the lawyer's office on March 15th, 15 years ago, I said evenly. You were 26, you said, and I quote, "I don't want anything to do with the restaurant business. It's too much work and not enough adventure. You were planning to move to Portland with that girlfriend of yours. Stephanie, I think her name was." Marcus stared at the paper like it might burst into flames. Around us, the restaurant had grown quiet. Even the kitchen seemed to have paused its usual clatter of plates and conversation. "You tricked me," he said finally, his voice weak. "I protected myself," I corrected. "Something I learned to do when you walked away from everything, including Dad." The mention of our father hit its mark. Marcus flinched, and for a moment, I saw not the entitled man who just tried to claim half my life's work, but the scared boy who'd run away from responsibility every time it got difficult. Dad always said. Dad never said the family business should be split equally. I'd interrupted, my patience finally exhausted, because there was no family business to split. There was just me, working 7 days a week, saving every penny, building something from nothing while you were off pursuing your dreams. And when you finally decided you wanted a piece of what I'd built, you assumed you could just walk in and demand it. Marcus looked around the restaurant, taking in the full dining room, the efficient staff, the obvious success of what I'd created. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what he tried to claim. "Victoria, he started to speak, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd spent 20 years ignoring our family, and now deserved half of everything I'd worked for. That his signature on a legal document didn't count because he'd been too irresponsible to read what he was signing. "You need to leave," I said quietly. "Now." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Almost. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Yes, it is." I folded the documents and returned them to my portfolio. "It's been over for 15 years. You just never bothered to remember." Marcus stood there for another moment, seeming smaller somehow in his expensive suit. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Jennifer held it open for him, and he disappeared into the evening without another word. The restaurant was completely silent for several seconds. Then, gradually, Conversations resumed. Silverware clinked against plates. The kitchen sounds returned. Life moved forward, as it always did. David appeared at my side, his expression concerned. "Boss, everything okay?" I straightened my jacket and checked my watch. 8:30. The evening rush was winding down. But there were still customers to serve, a kitchen to manage, a business to run. The business I'd built without help, without handouts, without family backing of any kind. "Everything's fine," I told David. "Check on table 12's dessert, and make sure the kitchen knows about the special dietary request for table 9. As David hurried away, I returned to my position at the host station and opened my manager's log. There were notes to make, schedules to review, orders to place for tomorrow's deliveries. The work never stopped, and I wouldn't have it any other way. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see something work-related, but the number was unfamiliar. "This is Marcus. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown. We should talk." I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having, especially with someone who'd already said everything they needed to say 15 years ago when they'd signed away their claim to my life. The next morning, I arrived at Harvest early, as I always did. The restaurant was quiet, peaceful in the way only empty restaurants can be. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air above the polished tables. This was my favorite time of day, before the controlled chaos of service began, when I could walk through my space and remember why I'd fallen in love with this business in the first place. I was reviewing inventory reports in my office when Jennifer knocked on the doorframe. "Victoria, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your brother." My stomach clenched. "Tell him we're closed." "He's not alone," Jennifer continued. "There's a woman with him. Older. She says she's a lawyer." I set down my pen and considered my options. Marcus had clearly spent the night thinking about our conversation, probably researching ways to contest the agreement he'd signed. The fact that he'd brought legal representation suggested he was serious about pursuing this further. Fine. If he wanted to do this the hard way, I was prepared. "Send them to the private dining room," I told Jennifer. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." I took those 5 minutes to gather everything I needed. Not just the incorporation documents, but the complete file on Victoria's Hospitality Group. Financial records showing 15 years of steady growth. Property deeds for all 5 restaurant locations. Business licenses. Tax returns. Partnership agreements with suppliers and vendors. Bank statements showing every loan payment, every investment, every dollar I'd earned and reinvested in my businesses. By the time I walked into the private dining room, Marcus and his lawyer were seated at the round table where I usually hosted wine tastings for VIP customers. The lawyer was a thin woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and an expensive briefcase. She looked competent, which meant this conversation was going to require my full attention. "Ms. Chen," the lawyer said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Patricia Hendricks from Hendricks, Walsh and Associates. Your brother has asked me to review some documents regarding your business interests." I shook her hand and took a seat across from them, placing my own folder on the table. "I assume Marcus has shown you the incorporation agreement?" "He has," she replied, "and I have to say, it raises some interesting questions about the circumstances under which it was signed." Marcus leaned forward, his confidence apparently restored by legal backup. "I was 26, Victoria, young and stupid. I didn't understand what I was signing. You were 26 and a college graduate. I corrected. You had a degree in business administration from State University. You understood exactly what you were signing, which is why you asked me to include the clause about being free to pursue other opportunities without interference. Patricia consulted her notes. My client believes he may have grounds to contest the agreement based on lack of full disclosure about the potential value of the business at the time of signing. I opened my folder and withdrew a thick stack of papers. These are copies of every document Marcus received before signing the incorporation agreement. Business plan, financial projections, market analysis, risk assessment. He was given 2 weeks to review everything with his own legal counsel before making a decision. I slid the papers across the table. That's his signature on the receipt acknowledging he'd received and reviewed all materials. Patricia examined the documents while Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I could see him trying to remember those weeks 15 years ago, probably realizing that I'd been more thorough than he'd given me credit for. Furthermore, I continued, Marcus was offered a partnership position at the time. 30% ownership in exchange for a $15,000 investment and a commitment to work in the business for at least 5 years. He declined, stating that he preferred to maintain his freedom rather than be tied down to one location. I retrieved another document from my folder. This is the written record of that conversation, which Marcus also signed. The lawyer studied the papers for several minutes while Marcus stared at the table. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. The confident challenge was gone, replaced by professional resignation. Mr. Chen, she said carefully, based on these documents, I don't believe you have grounds for a legal challenge. The incorporation agreement appears to have been executed properly, with full disclosure and adequate time for consideration. Marcus's face went red. But the family business. There was no family business, Patricia interrupted gently. According to these records, your sister started her company with her own capital and her own credit. Your father doesn't appear to have had any ownership interest or involvement in the business. He gave her the idea. Marcus insisted desperately. He always talked about opening a restaurant. Talking about something and actually doing it are very different things, I said. Dad dreamed about a lot of things. Playing professional baseball, writing a novel, opening a restaurant. But dreaming and building aren't the same thing. The room fell silent. Patricia was organizing her papers, clearly preparing to leave. Marcus was staring at his hands, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. There is one option, Patricia said carefully. Your sister could choose to voluntarily modify the original agreement. Create a new partnership structure, if she were so inclined. Both of them looked at me expectantly. Marcus's eyes held a desperate hope that made him look younger, more like the brother I'd once idolized before I learned that admiration was a one-way street in our family. I considered the proposal for exactly 3 seconds. No, I said simply. Marcus's face crumpled. Victoria, please. I'm family. Family, I repeated slowly. Where was family when I was working 3 jobs to save money for my first restaurant? Where was family when I spent 6 months sleeping in the back office because I couldn't afford both rent and restaurant equipment? Where was family when Dad was dying and I was handling everything alone? I stood up, gathering my documents. You had 15 years to be family, Marcus. You chose adventure instead. You chose freedom. You chose to walk away every time things got difficult. And now you want to walk back in and claim half of what I built while you were gone. I made mistakes, he said quietly. You made choices, I corrected. And so did I. I chose to stay. I chose to work. I chose to build something lasting. and I chose to protect it from people who only show up when there's something to gain. Patricia closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. Mr. Chen, I think we're finished here. I'll send you a full written assessment. But my preliminary opinion is that your sister's position is legally sound. After they left, I sat alone in the private dining room for several minutes, looking out at the main dining area where my staff was setting up for the lunch service. In a few hours, this place would be full of customers enjoying meals prepared by chefs I'd trained, served by waitstaff I'd hired, in an atmosphere I'd created from nothing. Marcus had called it the family business, but he was wrong. This wasn't a family business. It was my business, built on my terms, with my vision, through my dedication. The fact that I shared DNA with someone who wanted to claim it didn't make it theirs. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. Can we please talk without lawyers? Just us. I read the message twice, then typed my response. We did talk. 15 years ago. You said you wanted nothing to do with the restaurant business. I respected your choice then, and I'm holding you to it now. I hit send and blocked his number. 3 months later, I was reviewing plans for my 6th restaurant location when David knocked on my office door. Boss, there's a guy outside who says he's your brother. He's not causing trouble, just sitting in his car across the street. Thought you should know. I looked out my window and saw Marcus's rental car parked under a streetlight. He'd been coming by once or twice a week, never entering, never confronting me, just sitting there like he was working up the courage for something. Leave him alone, I told David. He's not hurting anyone. You sure? I could call the police if he's harassing you. He's not harassing me, I said. He's just figuring out what he lost. That evening, as I locked up the restaurant, I walked past Marcus's car on my way to the parking garage. He rolled down his window as I approached. Victoria, he said quietly, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not for trying to get part of your business, but for not being there when you were building it. And for not being there when Dad needed us. I stopped walking but didn't move closer to the car. Okay. I know I can't undo 20 years of being absent, he continued. And I know you don't owe me anything. I just wanted you to know that I see what you built here. And I'm proud of you, even if I don't deserve to be. For a moment, I saw the brother I'd once looked up to, before he chose an escape over responsibility, before he decided that family was optional. It was tempting to soften, to offer some kind of reconciliation or olive branch. But forgiveness and trust were different things, and trust, once broken repeatedly, couldn't be repaired with apologies alone. Thank you for saying that, I told him, but it doesn't change anything. He nodded, understanding. I know, I just needed to say it. Marcus rolled up his window and drove away. I never saw him again, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved back to California and was working as a restaurant manager for someone else's chain. Apparently, he'd finally developed an appreciation for the business he'd once dismissed as too much work. 5 years later, I opened my 10th restaurant location. The food critic from the city's largest newspaper wrote a feature article about my restaurant empire, calling me one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the hospitality industry. The article mentioned my humble beginnings, my innovative approach to local sourcing, and my commitment to employee development. It didn't mention Marcus at all. Why would it? He'd never been part of the story I was writing. As I stood in the kitchen of my newest location, watching my chefs prepare for the opening night service, I thought about the choices that had led me here. Every sacrifice, every risk, every moment when I could have given up but didn't. Every person who had doubted me, dismissed me, or underestimated what I was capable of achieving. Marcus had been wrong about the family business. This wasn't something I'd inherited or been handed. This was something I'd earned. One customer, one meal, one perfectly executed service at a time. And no one, family or otherwise, could take that away from me. The dinner rush was about to begin, and I had a restaurant to run. The moment I pulled into my driveway and saw Patricia standing in my garage with a stack of bills in her hand, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. My mother-in-law had that particular smile she wore when she believed she'd done something exceptionally clever, the kind that made my stomach tighten with dread. "Victoria," she called out cheerfully, waving the money like a trophy. "Perfect timing. I have wonderful news." I stepped out of my Honda Civic slowly, scanning the garage. The space where my project car usually sat was conspicuously empty. Just an oil stain on the concrete and the faint smell of motor oil lingering in the air. "Where's the Cobra?" I asked quietly, though I already suspected the answer. Patricia's smile widened. "I sold that junky old car for you. Got $3,000 cash, which is probably more than that rust bucket was worth. You needed something more practical anyway, honey. A woman your age driving around in some beat-up sports car from the 60s. It was embarrassing." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways. I stared at the empty space where I'd spent the last 4 years of my life meticulously restoring a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427. Not just any Cobra, but one of only 348 ever made. A car I'd purchased as a rusted shell and rebuilt from the ground up with my own hands. "You sold it," I repeated, my voice steady despite the hurricane building in my chest. "For your own good," Patricia said, smoothing her perfectly styled gray hair. "Mark agrees with me. You've been wasting too much time in this garage playing with car parts instead of focusing on more appropriate hobbies. Maybe now you'll take up something more suitable, like gardening or cooking." I walked closer, noting the way she held the cash possessively against her chest. $3,000 for a car that had just been appraised at $400,000. "Who did you sell it to?" I asked. "Some young man who answered my Craigslist ad. Such a sweet boy. Said he'd been looking for a project car just like this one. I told him it needed a lot of work, but he seemed excited about it." She beamed with satisfaction. "I even threw in all those expensive tools cluttering up the garage." My tools. My grandfather's tools. The Snap-on collection worth more than most people's cars, accumulated over 30 years of professional racing and restoration work. Tools I'd inherited when he passed, along with his knowledge and his passion for automotive engineering. "Patricia," I said carefully, "did you happen to keep any documentation from the sale?" "Of course I did. I'm not careless." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her purse. "Here's the bill of sale. Everything's perfectly legal." I took the paper with steady hands, though inside I was calculating just how monumentally she'd destroyed something irreplaceable. The bill of sale was handwritten on notebook paper, signed with barely legible names. No title transfer, no proper identification recorded. "This young man," I said, "did he show you his driver's license? Get his address?" Patricia waved dismissively. "He paid cash. That's all that matters." "Really, Victoria, you should be thanking me. Now you can buy something sensible with that money. Maybe a nice set-in." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. "You know what, Patricia? You're absolutely right. Thank you for taking care of this for me." The confusion that flickered across her face was almost worth the devastation. She'd expected an argument, tears, anger. Instead, I was giving her exactly what she wanted: gratitude and submission. "Well," she said, somewhat deflated by my response, "you're welcome. I just want what's best for you, dear. Mark will be so pleased when he gets home from his business trip." Mark, my husband of 6 years, who'd given his mother a key to our house for emergencies and never quite managed to set appropriate boundaries. Mark, who thought my hobby was cute, but didn't really understand why I spent my weekends covered in grease instead of shopping or getting my nails done. "I'm sure he will be," I said, pulling out my phone. "Patricia, would you mind waiting here for just a moment? I need to make a quick call." She nodded, still counting the bills with obvious satisfaction. "Take your time, dear. I'll just tidy up this garage a bit while you're handling whatever business you need to." I walked to the far corner of the garage, where the Wi-Fi signal was strongest, and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Detective Martinez, this is Victoria Chen. I need to report a theft." "Victoria? What happened?" Detective Carmen Martinez had been a friend since college, back when we were both struggling through our respective programs. She in criminal justice, me in mechanical engineering. She knew about my work, my reputation in the vintage racing community, and the value of what I'd been building. "Someone sold my Cobra without my permission," I said quietly, glancing back at Patricia, who was now rearranging my remaining tools with the confidence of someone who'd never held a wrench in her life. "The 67? The one you've been restoring for Barrett Jackson?" "That's the one." Carmen's whistle was low and sympathetic. "Jesus, Victoria. Who did it?" "My mother-in-law. She had access to the garage and thought she was doing me a favor by getting rid of my junk car for $3,000. There was a long pause. 3,000? For numbers matching 427 Cobra. Apparently, she listed it on Craigslist as a project car that needed work. That's got to be the most expensive mistake in automotive history. What do you need from me?" "I've got the buyer's information from the bill of sale, but it's pretty sparse. Can you run what I have and see if we can track down where my car went?" "Absolutely. Text me everything you've got. And Victoria, I'm sorry. I know what that car meant to you." I glanced at Patricia, who was now trying to organize my socket sets by color rather than size. "Thanks, Carmen. I'll send you the details now." After ending the call, I typed out the buyer's information, what little there was, and sent it to Carmen. Then I walked back to where Patricia stood, her hands on her hips, surveying the garage like a general reviewing conquered territory. "All taken care of," I said pleasantly. "Now, why don't you head home? Mark should be back from Chicago tomorrow evening, and I'm sure you'll want to tell him all about your successful sale." Of course. She gathered her purse and the cash, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. "And remember, this is really for the best. You'll see." After she left, I stood alone in the garage, staring at the empty space where my Cobra had lived. 4 years of work. 4 years of research, of hunting down original parts, of learning welding techniques from YouTube videos, of rebuilding that 427 big block engine by hand. 4 years of connecting with my grandfather's memory through every bolt I turned and every panel I straightened. Patricia saw junk. I saw art. The next morning, Carmen called with news. "The name on the bill of sale is fake," she said without preamble. "David Johnson, but the phone number doesn't exist, and there's no David Johnson at the address listed. Professional buyer? That's what I'm thinking. Someone who knows to scout Craigslist for undervalued classics, uses fake information, and probably flips them quickly through auction houses or private dealers. I leaned back in my office chair, staring out the window of the engineering firm where I worked as a senior consultant. So my car is probably already gone. Maybe not. I've got some contacts in the classic car world. Let me make some calls, see if anyone's heard about a Cobra suddenly appearing on the market. Thanks, Carmen. I owe you. Just promise me that when this is over, you'll let me take a ride in whatever car you build next. That afternoon, as I sat in a client meeting reviewing stress analyses for a new bridge design, my phone buzzed with a text from Mark. Mom told me about the car. Probably for the best. Maybe now we can use the garage for storage like normal people. I stared at the message for a long moment, then turned my phone face down and returned my attention to the meeting. Some conversations were better had in person. Mark arrived home the next evening in his usual flurry of activity. Suitcase dropped in the entryway, tie loosened, already talking about his successful presentations in Chicago before he'd even properly said hello. Victoria, you should have seen the client's face when I showed them our cost projections, he said, loosening his tie. They practically signed the contract on the spot. That's wonderful, I said from the kitchen, where I was preparing dinner. How was your flight? Delayed, of course, but first class makes everything bearable. He wandered into the kitchen and kissed my cheek absently. Mom told me about the car situation. I have to say, I'm relieved. That thing was becoming an obsession. I continued stirring the pasta sauce, my movements calm and measured. Is that how you saw it? Come on, Vic. You spent every weekend in that garage. It was like being married to a mechanic. He laughed, clearly not noticing the tension in my shoulders. Now we can actually use the space for something practical. Maybe set up a home gym or create some proper storage. Your mother sold my car without my permission, I said quietly. She was trying to help. You know how she is, always thinking about what's best for family. He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a beer. Besides, $3,000 isn't bad for something that old. We can put it toward a nice vacation. I turned to face him, studying the man I'd married. Mark was handsome in a conventional way, tall, well-dressed, successful in his sales career. But standing in our kitchen, casually dismissing 4 years of my work as a minor inconvenience, he looked like a stranger. That car was worth $400,000, I said. Mark nearly choked on his beer. What? It was a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427, one of 348 ever made. I'd been restoring it to museum quality for the Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale. The color drained from his face. You never told me it was worth that much. You never asked. In 6 years of marriage, you never once asked me about the technical aspects of what I was doing. Never inquired about the value. Never showed any interest beyond complaining that I spent too much time working on it. But $3,000. Mom said it was just an old project car. Your mother committed theft. She sold property that didn't belong to her for a fraction of its value to a buyer who gave false information. Mark set down his beer with shaking hands. Can we get it back? I don't know. The police are investigating, but the buyer used a fake name and address. Professional car thieves often use Craigslist to find exactly these kinds of opportunities. Expensive classics being sold by people who don't know their value. Oh God, what are we going to do? For the first time since I'd come home to find Patricia counting her cash, I smiled. Not the polite, controlled smile I'd been wearing for the past 2 days, but something colder. We are not going to do anything, Mark. I am going to continue working with the police to recover my property. You are going to have a very difficult conversation with your mother about boundaries and legal consequences. The next morning brought a call from Carmen that changed everything. I found your car, she said, excitement clear in her voice. I was in my office, but I immediately closed the door and sat down heavily. Where? Scottsdale. A private collector named James Morrison bought it from a dealer yesterday. Paid $250,000, which means someone made a very nice profit flipping your Cobra. $250. It was worth $400 fully restored. The dealer probably told him it needed work. But here's the good news. Morrison is a legitimate collector, not a flipper. When I explained the situation, he was horrified. He's willing to cooperate fully. What does that mean? It means we can prove the chain of theft. Morrison has documentation from the dealer. The dealer has records from the original buyer, your fake David Johnson. And we have Patricia's bill of sale. It's a clear case of receiving stolen property. I leaned back in my chair, finally allowing myself to breathe. So we can get it back. We can get it back. Morrison's insurance will cover his loss. The dealer is already cooperating to avoid criminal charges, and we're working with Scottsdale PD to trace the money trail. How long? Could be a few weeks for all the paperwork, but your car is being held as evidence. It's not going anywhere. That evening, I called a family meeting. Mark sat across from me at our dining room table, looking haggard and pale. Patricia arrived fashionably late, still carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed she'd done a good deed. I don't understand why we need a formal meeting, she said, settling into her chair with a slight huff. I already explained everything to Mark. I sold that old car for a very reasonable price. Patricia, I said calmly, I need you to understand something very important. That car you sold was worth $400,000. She blinked. Don't be ridiculous, Victoria. It was just an old. It was a 1967 Shelby Cobra 427. One of the rarest and most valuable muscle cars ever made. I've spent 4 years restoring it to concours condition. Patricia's confident expression flickered. That's impossible. It looked like junk. That's because restoration is a process. What you saw as rust and primer was actually a car that had been completely disassembled, with every component rebuilt or restored to original specifications. I pulled out my tablet and opened the photo album I'd been keeping throughout the restoration. This is what it looked like when I started. The first photo showed the Cobra as I'd found it. A rusted shell with no engine, no interior, sitting on blocks in a barn in Arizona. Patricia looked at it dismissively. See? Junk. I swiped to the next photo. This is after I'd media blasted the body and begun bodywork. The shell gleamed with primer. Every line clean and true. Another swipe. The engine rebuild. My grandfather's tools spread across the workbench. The 427 big block torn down to individual components. Each piece cleaned and measured and restored. Patricia's expression grew less certain with each image. The interior restoration. Hand-stitched leather seats. Original gauges rebuilt and recalibrated. A dashboard that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line in 1967. The final assembly. Everything coming together, chrome gleaming, paint flawless. And this, I said, showing her the final photos, is what you sold for $3,000. The completed Cobra sat in our garage, every surface perfect, every detail authentic. It looked like it had been transported through time from the Shelby factory, untouched by the decades. Patricia's face had gone ashen. I had no idea. The young man who bought it wasn't a sweet boy looking for a project car, I continued. He was a professional car thief who uses Craigslist to find exactly these situations. Valuable cars being sold by people who don't recognize their worth. Car thief? Mark's voice cracked. The name and address he gave were fake. The police are investigating, but he's probably done this before. Take advantage of family disputes, estate sales, or well-meaning relatives who think they're helping. Patricia was staring at the photos, her mouth slightly open. $400,000? That's what it was worth. The police have found it, by the way. A collector in Scottsdale bought it from a dealer for $250,000. He's cooperating with the investigation. So we can get it back? Patricia asked hopefully. I can get it back, I corrected. But there's something else you need to understand. What you did was theft. You sold property that didn't belong to you. The district attorney's office is reviewing the case for criminal charges. The silence that followed was profound. Patricia looked from me to Mark, then back to the photos on my tablet. Criminal charges, she whispered. Theft of property over $100,000 is a first-degree felony in this state. The mandatory minimum sentence is 2 years in prison. Mark buried his face in his hands. Mom, what did you do? I was trying to help, Patricia said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. I thought it was just taking up space. You thought you knew better than I did about my own possessions, I said quietly. You decided that my interests and hobbies were inappropriate and took it upon yourself to fix my life according to your standards. Patricia was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll pay you back. With what money? You have $3,000. The car was worth $400,000. We'll figure something out. Mark said desperately. Maybe we can take out loans, or... Mark, I said, my voice firm enough to cut through his panic. I want you to be very clear about something. Your mother committed a felony. She stole property worth more than most people's houses. This isn't something you can fix with good intentions and a payment plan. Over the next 2 weeks, as the police investigation proceeded and the legal machinery ground into motion, I watched my family dynamic shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mark, faced with the reality of his mother's actions and their consequences, began to see our relationship differently. He'd spent years minimizing my interests and supporting his mother's interference because it was easier than confronting the family dynamics he'd grown up with. Now, forced to acknowledge that my hobby was actually a sophisticated technical skill worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, he was struggling to reconcile the woman he thought he'd married with the expert craftsperson I'd always been. I never realized, he said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. I mean, I knew you were good with cars, but I didn't understand. You didn't want to understand, I replied. It was easier to dismiss it as a quirky hobby than to recognize that I might have expertise in something you knew nothing about. The legal resolution came faster than I'd expected. Morrison, the collector in Scottsdale, was indeed everything Carmen had said, horrified by the situation and eager to cooperate. The dealer who'd sold him the car agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The money trail led back to the original thief, who turned out to be part of a larger operation targeting classic cars. Patricia, faced with the possibility of prison time and the reality of what she destroyed, accepted a plea agreement. 5 years probation, restitution payments, and community service. But the damage to our family relationships was permanent. Mark and I entered counseling, but it became clear that this incident had revealed fundamental incompatibilities we'd both been avoiding. He needed a wife who fit his image of conventional success, someone whose achievements complemented his, rather than challenging his understanding of the world. I needed a partner who could respect my expertise and interests, even when they fell outside his experience. 6 months after Patricia sold my car, Mark and I signed divorce papers. It was amicable, all things considered. He kept the house with its empty garage. I took my tools, the ones that hadn't been sold, and moved to a small place outside the city with a 2-car garage and room to work. The Cobra was returned to me in perfect condition, apparently none the worse for its adventure in theft and recovery. Morrison had stored it properly and even had his own mechanic perform a full inspection to ensure no damage had occurred during transport. But I'd lost the desire to finish that particular project. Too much had happened, too many associations had been tainted. Instead, I sold it myself, properly this time, through Barrett Jackson, with full documentation and provenance. It brought $420,000 at auction. With that money, I bought something I'd always dreamed of but never thought I could afford, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda that had been languishing in a barn for 30 years. Not as rare as the Cobra, but more personally meaningful. My grandfather had owned one just like it, had taught me to drive in one just like it. This time, though, I was building it for myself. Not for auction, not for investment, just for the pure joy of taking something broken and making it beautiful again. On weekends, I work in my garage with the doors open, music playing, tools spread across the workbench exactly the way my grandfather taught me. Neighbors stop by sometimes, curious about the old car taking shape under my hands. Some of them are surprised to find a woman doing the work, but most are just impressed by the craftsmanship. Mark sends occasional texts, usually on holidays or anniversaries. He's dating someone new, he tells me, someone who appreciates the finer things in life. I always text back politely, wishing him well. Patricia and I don't speak at all anymore. That's probably for the best. Last month, Carmen stopped by to see the Cuba's progress. She ran her hands over the freshly painted panels, admiring the deep plum metallic that seemed to glow even in the fluorescent garage lighting. "You know," she said, "I think this one's going to be even better than the Cobra." I smiled, wiping grease from my hands with an old shop rag. Different goals this time. The Cobra was about proving I could do museum-quality work. This one's about remembering why I fell in love with cars in the first place. And how's that going? I looked at the Cuda, still months away from completion, but already showing the promise of what it would become. Every curve was perfect, every component chosen with care, every detail a reflection of decades of accumulated knowledge and skill. "Better than I expected," I said. "Turns out, when you're building something for yourself, instead of for other people's approval, the work is a lot more satisfying." Carmen laughed. "Sounds like you learned more than just automotive repair from this whole experience." Maybe I had. Maybe sometimes it takes someone else trying to steal your dreams to help you realize what those dreams actually mean to you. And maybe, sometimes the thing that looks like the worst betrayal becomes the catalyst for the life you were always meant to live.